All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Elizabeth Krupinski. I'm the co-director of the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center. Next slide. I would like to extend a very special welcome to all of you who have joined today's webinar, especially those of you from Arizona and our Southwest region, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico. We are using CART services from our University of Arizona Disability Resource Center. So if you need them, you just click on the icon that's at the bottom of your screen, just scroll over. It's on that same line as the chat function, and it should just kind of pop up, click, and it should be enabled. Next slide. We respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous people. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being the home to the Ohodum and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings such as this, partnerships, and community service. Next slide. Since 2011, the Southwest Telehealth Resource Center, which is funded by HRSA, the federal government for our grant, has partnered with the Arizona Telemedicine Program to bring you almost 200 informative webinars. Today's webinar is also being sponsored by the Arizona Department of Health Services. Next slide. As you join the webinar today, your microphone was muted. Sorry, but that's the way it goes. Please use the chat function in Zoom. If you want to ask questions, we'll be monitoring those throughout, and then we'll deal with those at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to access it on demand from our website, and you can see the link there, telemedicine.arizona.edu/webinars/previous. With any luck, it will be up by the end of the day. If not today, then tomorrow. The URL is listed here on the slide, and we're also going to put it in the chat. And from the chat, you can actually just go there directly. But like I said, you've got to wait till later today or tomorrow to actually have this presentation there. Next slide. Today's webinar offers diversity, equity, and inclusion credit.
Holly, can you go back one slide, please?
For University of Arizona College of Medicine, Tucson faculty, residents, GRAs, GTAs, and the University of Arizona staff. Please note, to be eligible for the 1 credit of UA-COM-T DEI credit, you must register for the DEI credit during the session today. You can do so by scanning the QR code, just get your phone, or using the URL listed on the slide. We're also going to put that into the chat so you can follow it directly. The survey will become interactive once the session concludes, and you will not be able to register for DEI credit afterwards. Now the next slide. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker. We are so lucky to have her, Holly Figueroa. Ms. Figueroa is Oke Owenge and Hopi from the village of Sipalavi and is Sun Clan. She serves as the tribal liaison for Health Choice Arizona. And as tribal liaison, she works to strengthen tribal relations with 17 tribes in HCA's service area. She focuses on crisis service, access to care, prevention, coordination of care, nation building, training and education, reducing health disparities, and stigma reduction. She is just a wonder in all the things that she does. She has a background in cultural competency, and she works to ensure that culturally appropriate services are delivered to all, including HCA members, and that providers meet the language and unique cultural needs of those who they serve. Holly also develops education and awareness programs for staff and residents of the HCA service area to help reduce the stigma aimed at diverse cultures and to raise awareness and decrease health disparities that they often suffer. She was born into a military family, as was I, and is the spouse of an Operation Desert Storm and Operation Vigilant Warrior veteran. She is a certified adult, youth, and veteran mental health first aid trainer. She is a Northern Arizona Healthcare Foundation certificate holder. She serves on the Arizona Town Hall Board of Directors, the Arizona Rural Health Association Board of Directors, and the MPOWRD Board of Directors. She is also a 1 in 10 volunteer, dedicated ally who works to advocate and ensure safe spaces for LGBTQ2S individuals and the community. Additionally, in her spare time, I guess, she pursues other ways to give back to her community and to be an effective advocate for Native American people elsewhere. So again, it's my distinct pleasure to hand things over to Holly. Thank you.
Nagwang Dawan Save, Ne Holly Figueroa Bahan Matsiwa, Ne Dalamana Mahopi Matsiwa, Ne Dawangwa, Ne Sapalangak, Sino, Ne Navatok Ovi Umgita. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly Figueroa. That is my English name. I am also referred to as Morning Girl in the Hopi language. As mentioned, I come from the village of Sipalavi, which is on the Hopi Reservation, which is in Northeast Arizona. I'm part of the Sun Clan, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm so thankful to have been invited to be here this afternoon with you all and talk with you a little bit about some of the work that I do. In this hour, we're going to try and cram a whole bunch of stuff in, but really it's a lot about providing some information and education so that you all will walk away with some understanding of what some of that tribal cultural awareness is. We'll talk about some telehealth in Indian country. We'll also talk about some cultural norms. I think it's important for us to understand that as service providers in whatever it is that we're doing. And just hopefully you'll walk away with some tips on how to be a good tribal partner, or if you are from a tribal community, how we can also serve as cultural brokers within the work that we do. So a lot of stuff we're going to try and cover here. And I will just start out with really talking about tribal sovereignty. I have been working my agency now for almost 12 years. Hard to believe. But I would say probably one of the strongest things that my agency really is mindful of is the sovereignty of tribal communities across our service area, across the state and even the country, and really understanding what that means. And that really helps to build that foundation to really make sure that we as service providers understand that these tribes are all unique, they're all different. If we honor and respect that, it really helps to foster those partnerships that we're really trying to build trust so that we can be good tribal partners within the work that we do. So making sure, I would say, start off, if you're trying to figure out how to be a good tribal partner, that's a good starting point there, is to really understand what tribal sovereignty means as you're moving forward. Another really good thing to understand, especially if you do work with tribal members in the state or whatever state you're from, is a lot of times tribal members have multiple avenues as to where they can access care. And sometimes that can be very complicated, very complex, very confusing. And so really having a good understanding of what that is. If you have a tribal liaison, if you have someone who's dedicated to working with this population, making sure that you understand what that is. Here in Arizona, we have many different tribal points where people can access care. And so it's really important for me to understand who those partners are, make sure I have good partnerships and relationships with them, because a lot of times we are coordinating care physically or on the back end, making sure that claims are processing appropriately, who's supposed to pay for what, all those kinds of things. So really acknowledging that, that some of our systems are really reliant on one another and really working to build those partnerships as well, because care coordination can definitely be very confusing, be very complex, and sometimes even frustrating. So making sure that we understand that moving forward. Moving into some cultural awareness, I really want to take some time to understand the history of the tribal members that we're serving. I think a lot of times we don't understand some of the reasons why tribal members or tribal communities are a little bit hesitant in engaging with services that we provide. I've had a lot of folks say, I'm trying to outreach to this tribal community, and they are just not willing to participate. What did I do, or what can I do? Really taking a moment to understand some of the history could really be helpful, and it could change a lot of times our perspective and our approaches to the work that we do. So if we look at this map here, we can see on this map, on the very top of your screen there up here, we look at what we know as the United States of America today. We see it, and we see at the very beginning there, it's all covered in red, and that represents all of the first peoples, all of the first tribal nations, villages, communities, because they're all different. This land was first habitated by those people, by those First Nations, by those first people, pre-colonization. Then, you know, we start to see, once Columbus discovered America, then we start to see a lot of change. Over time, we see that tribes, and we've heard some of the history of the tribes being pushed out of their homelands, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you notice, you'll see that a lot of the red portions in what we see today are kind of more towards the west. We have a lot of little tiny tribes over here in the East Coast, but a lot of them were driven west. And so we see a majority of our larger tribal communities and tribes in the western portion of the state. But we still do have a lot of tribal communities here. And what we know about tribal communities or tribal members in relation to population, we know that about 2% of the general population is comprised of American Indian Alaskan Natives. Compared to this here, that's a very significant change, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So right now, in our current day, there's a lot of initiatives and movements to really preserve language and culture. And so a lot of that is happening simultaneously and being infused into a lot of the work that's happening. So we saw that, you know, the red picture of the United States, and we saw that, you know, a lot of the land was very minimal, and even we don't know what the future of that's going to look like. But to understand a lot of that, we also want to look at the impact that a lot of federal policy has had on tribal communities. And if we look at this timeline, if you will, and this is not all of them, this is just some of the policies or laws that were happening over time. You know, again, we had pre-colonization, where we had first peoples were doing their thing. They were living, they were farming, they were fishing, they were hunting. They were very much self-sustained in their communities that they had. Then, you know, 1492 comes along, Columbus comes in, you know, then we start to see more folks coming into the area. And then we start to see a more formal government be developed and moving forward. So a lot of these things, if we look at, you know, the US Constitution, right, that document was written by white men for white men. What was the impact of that document or that policy on tribal communities, tribal individuals, families? If we think about that, was not always good. Then we start to move on, and we start seeing things like the Removal Act, where we were seeing unsettled lands being taken in exchange for Indian lands. So a lot of the land starts to get taken away. The Allotment Act of 1887, or you might know or be familiar with the Dawes Act, where they start breaking up all of the land and then, you know, into smaller pieces to be parceled out to individuals. This was also in order to get land as a tribal member, get some of your land back, then you had to prove that you were a tribal member. And so that's where we start to see tribal members have to get certificates of Indian blood. We start to see this process where we're now having to prove that we are tribal members. We can go on and on and on, and I'm not going to go through all of these because we don't have a whole lot of time, but you will see as time progresses some of the impact that these laws have had on tribal communities and why perhaps there is some different perceptions or mistrust or distrust. We still see the impact of policy and law to this day. A lot of times we're still trying to preserve the land. We're still trying to preserve the remains and the sacred sites. So there's still a lot of work happening to reclaim a lot of the things that have happened to our ancestors way before we were here. So a lot of this carries forward, unfortunately, as you know, those stories are shared with myself, with my children, and it'll probably keep going on and on. So there's sometimes not always the best relationship with non-tribal entities and tribal governments or tribal communities, if you can kind of think about that for a moment. Some of the other things that I want to highlight in relation to you know, European contact or colonization, some of the impact that that has had on tribal members. We see the introduction to alcohol, guns, disease. There were times when disease-infested blankets were given to children so that they would die. Sugar, it was even impacting our food, some of our non-traditional foods. Sugar, some other kinds of foods that were given to tribal members when they were being moved off of their lands. They were given some of their non-traditional foods. Homophobia was also introduced to our tribal communities. It was never an issue to have individuals who identify outside of the binary to be unaccepted in their communities. So we see a lot of these introductions of perceptions or things that aren't acceptable within a particular culture or community. We saw genocide happen, and I don't know how much you know about some of the things that we're starting to see right now, especially in relation to the boarding school eras starting back in the early 1900s. We have Deb Haaland now, who is in the administration, who has just recently declared a review of all of the policy in relation to boarding schools, because we've heard a lot of these stories, and I still have family members today that tell me their stories of being with families that, families that they were placed with and how they were treated and how they were having to appear differently than where they were from. Children forced to cut their hair. They were not able to speak their language. If they did, they were disciplined. A lot of times they would be isolated, whether they were in a room or in a cage. They were physically and sexually abused, starved. Females were sterilized so that they couldn't reproduce. A lot of these things are stories that are still being shared, and this influences a lot of our tribal members who we're trying to work with today. And so it's something that we need to be able to acknowledge and understand so that we're more culturally sensitive and we're more culturally appropriate in our approach. So we hear a lot about historical trauma. A lot of what I just shared, if you can imagine, you know, is a lot of trauma. And I know that tribal nations aren't the only ones who have experienced a lot of these these activities as our nation grew, you know, a lot of different cultures were experiencing a lot of these same type of treatment. But in relation to historical trauma in tribal communities, you know, they were forced to be relocated off of their homelands into a different place where perhaps they weren't used to farming or they weren't used to hunting in those areas. Treaties would have been broken for those tribes who had treaties with the government, you know, all kinds of things, political injustices. A lot of this we saw even during the COVID pandemic. So these things still somehow keep impacting our tribal communities even today. So I put this picture in here. This picture just breaks my heart. And this is during one of the signings, I think it was of the Allotment Act, where this tribal leader was signing over the rights to his land because he was overtaken, and he's crying at the fact that he was powerless over what the government was doing. And so this is just another continued influencer that's out there that really is something, unfortunately, that our tribal members have had to experience. Some of the things that we continue to see today as an outcome of the colonization and oppression is we see large numbers of PTSD, a lot of fear and anxiety, the distrust or mistrust, low self-esteem, a decreased faith in traditional medicine. And that's a little bit different because some of those folks who did go into the boarding schools or who were taken away from their homes were placed into a totally different environment. They were no longer practicing their culture or speaking their language. So of course you kind of lose some of that. And especially as a young child, if you don't have that around you all the time, then you lose a lot of that. So we see a lot of that today. So what does that mean for today? You know, for folks like myself or our younger generation or generations to come, what does that mean? How does that affect us? And how does that affect the work that we do? So today, Native Americans who are doing their thing are influenced a lot by the stories. Like I mentioned, stories from their families, story from other tribal communities about these things that happened, how the oppression happened, what did that intergenerational anger is passed along, and now there's studies that are showing that it's part of the DNA of a lot of these tribal members. So it's again something that influences even those who had not experienced directly. It influences us to be more protective, a little bit more reserved perhaps, and a little bit more intentional in who we are engaging with moving forward. So I just threw in some pictures here. The middle picture there are pictures of children at the Carlisle Indian School. And I think that's like back in the early 1900s. And I don't know if any of you have been following some of the news around the boarding school incidences, but there are children who are buried in these boarding schools who are being finally taken back to their homelands, which is a very ceremonial type activity. So it's very interesting to see how this is going to unfold and impact tribal members even more. The picture on your right here, this is a group of Hopi men, Hopi leaders, village leaders, clan leaders. These men were taken to Alcatraz in San Francisco because they were protecting and hiding their children from the missionaries taking their children to Keams Canyon, to the boarding school there in Keams Canyon. So they would hide their children. And so they were taken for not allowing their children to be taken from their homes. So some of the stuff there. So how do you like my PowerPoint skills there. So I have for you here a short video, and it's just going to kind of reinforce a lot of the information that we shared, but perhaps there's some information in there that will be helpful as well.
Almost mad all the time. Problems controlling my anger. Can't really think of just one time. I know most of my anger comes from pain. Someone once told me the reason I have so much anger is from my dad, and it comes from my grandpa, which comes from his mom. That the anger is pain from so long ago. She says Indians are so full of pain, causes them to drink it all away, but instead it causes more pain. I have anger from pain. I have many generations of built up pain. I hope that I can learn to forgive and heal, so I no longer carry the pain of my ancestors. I will forgive. I will heal.
1.5% of the U.S. population is Native American. Historical events such as removal from homelands, sexual abuse, exposure to violence, boarding schools, massacres, forced relocation, homicide, suicide, and multiple victimization are ways in which trauma has affected Native communities. 40% of Native Americans live below the poverty line. 39% have some form of a disability. Native children have 2.5 times greater risk of experiencing a trauma, and 30% have some form of depression, while 10% have PTSD. The suicide rate is 3 times higher for Native Americans. Native American women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped or sexually assaulted than women in the U.S. in general. Native Americans are 2.2 times more likely to have diagnosed diabetes.
Wow, so thoughts, please feel free to put your thoughts in the chat box there. But yeah, that's some really good information for you there. So we're going to talk a little bit about the tribes. So again, talking about tribal sovereignty, what does that mean exactly? What does tribal sovereignty mean? Why do you keep talking about it? Tribal sovereignty is related to tribal nations. A lot of them have different things that they call themselves, tribes, nations. And this is really the ability for tribal nations to govern themselves. They have their own laws, they develop their own laws, they have their own tribal court systems, they have their own law enforcement, and so they are pretty much like little tiny countries, if you can think about them like that. They're little tiny countries that govern themselves. The states have no jurisdiction on tribal lands. And so that's one of the big things I have to be mindful of, because I work for, I have a state contract to deliver physical and behavioral health services. So what does that mean in the work that I do? That means that I have to develop, MOUs or letter of agreements to be able to provide services on tribal lands. And so that's where you want to make sure that you are understanding what tribal sovereignty means, especially when we're coordinating care for individuals who perhaps are on reservation. Their sovereignty then a lot of times is lost once they're off reservation. So some of these things have an impact in the work that we're doing, especially for service delivery providers. Whether you're in the healthcare field or behavioral health or whatever field that you're in, some of the things you want to be mindful of in relation to tribal sovereignty. Federally recognized tribes in the country, 574 tribes. So if you can think about 574 countries, in this nation, and you know, in your respective locations, what tribes are around your area? What tribes do you work with? And even if they're not from your state, I know here in Arizona, we probably have over 300 tribal nations represented here in our state, just from people from all these different tribal communities that make Arizona their home. So I'm not just thinking about the tribes that are in my state in Arizona. I also have to be aware that I might have folks who are living here from a village in Alaska, or who are coming in from New York or from California. So being mindful of those things too. It's great to have the knowledge about the tribes from your state, but also acknowledging and being mindful of people who are also living within states that perhaps aren't specific to the state you live in or work in. So some considerations, and I think that this is something I always talk about when I'm doing training or working with folks in my field, is understanding that health is a cultural construct based on cultural issues and beliefs about the nature of disease and illness and the body and the human body. Therefore, we have to consider this in the delivery of our service. What does that mean? Well, for me, as a Hopi woman, and how I was taught, how I was raised, things such as if I were to go into my doctor's office and say, you know, I was feeling a bit anxious or something, and they're going to ask me or tell me why I feel that way. Some of the things that I might want to consider before I go into the doctor is, maybe I need to go and see my my medicine person, whether it's a man or a woman, because if I think about what did I do, or how did I get to this point, we have a lot of teachings about different things that are outside or just about our surroundings. So for instance, pregnant women in my tribe, in Hopi, this is Hopi, should not be tending to animals. They should not be around death or blood, because that can then kind of transfer to the womb, to the child in the womb. We were not supposed to play with snakes or lizards, reptiles, because those have an impact on your brain. Same thing if we sit, you know, people love to look at the sky and watch the clouds move. That's a no-no in our culture, because again, that has an impact on your mind. And so we think about those things and how symptoms come about. And we think about, what did our culture teach us, or what values do we have that might have an impact on how I'm looking at this particular sickness or illness. This has had a big effect, especially during the pandemic and there's a virus. So if you were to ever engage with tribal folks from different tribes and get their perspectives from a tribal perspective on the virus, you probably would hear a lot of different things there. But acknowledging, again, is something we're talking about. And so what we're really talking about is being culturally sensitive, right? Being culturally appropriate in our approach to serving tribal members. And you know, we have things such as cultural competency. You know, I was a cultural competency administrator, and the role of this person is really to make sure that we understand all of the different cultures, the languages, all of those things are infused and considered when we're rolling out services. Setting up trainings, you know, doing online trainings, you know, all those kinds of things, which is great. That's all great. I get to check the box. I did my annual cultural competency training, whether it was in person or if it was just on a Relias type training, an online training mechanism, which is good. But what we're starting to really look at and really starting to promote is the cultural humility. And what is cultural humility? Cultural humility really is what we want to see folks practice more than cultural competency. Cultural humility really de-emphasizes that we are know-it-alls, if you will. I don't know everything there is to know about everything. I don't know everything there is to know about being a tribal liaison. I don't know everything there is to know about being Hopi. I will probably learn every single day till the day I die. Probably learn something when I die, I would imagine. And understanding that I'm not more than, and you're not less than me. I'm learning from you and you're learning from me. And if I'm open to this and I'm open to this mindset, not only am I building trust and I'm having a good balanced dialogue and relationship, then it kind of lets down all the walls and it allows us to be more exploratory within ourselves. You know, we're going to go out and we're going to learn something. If somebody invites you to a traditional dance somewhere, take that opportunity to do that, because then when we have the willingness to learn about one another, the more we're able to have positive outcomes, which is a lot of times what we're striving for, from, you know, performance perspectives, but also in general, is really practicing the ability to have that cultural humility and have that be more of a two-way learning process about those that we're serving. And so the impact of cultural difference, and I'm sure that we probably have a diverse group of folks attending today, and you can probably look at this diagram here and relate to it, I'm sure, in some sense. If we think about cross-cultural differences in the services that we provide, are those things being considered? Are we ensuring that these cultural considerations are infused in all of the pieces of the service that we provide? You know, whether we're doing staffings or team meetings, are we ensuring that end-of-life decision-making processes are coming from with a good approach to it with those that we're serving? The Western medicine model versus a traditional medicine model. And that, you know, could be across cultures, not just tribal culture, but really looking at what that means and understanding how, if you were to make your own diagram and the things that you do, how are those, each one of those boxes being, you know, have a cultural component and consideration aligned with it. Some of the tribal challenges, and we heard some of these things in the video, but I just wanted to go over them really quickly as well, is understanding that a lot of our American Indian Alaskan Natives are at a higher rate of poverty than the general population. So 2 times higher if we think about that. Health insurance, 3 times greater lacking health insurance than the general population. Funding issues are always, I think funding issues are all over, but a little bit more so with our tribal communities, funding becomes an issue. A lack of familiarity with some of the policies, again, associated with the tribal communities that you're working with. Everyone is different. Everyone's priority is different a lot of times. So understanding that. And then of course, there are the complexities and the logistics. So in my service area, I serve 17 tribal nations, some border metropolitan areas, some are frontier rural, and I have 1 tribal community that is at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So understanding that a lot of the complexities in care coordination or service delivery is what I need to be mindful of in relation to the tribes that I work with. Tribal mental health, as we also heard, American Indians, Alaskan Natives experience serious psychological distress 1.5 times more than the general population. Mental health disorders are also very high. PTSD, substance use disorders, depression and anxiety. A lot of these have been heightened during the pandemic as well, because a lot of tribal communities were sheltering in place. I know in my service area, I had tribes whose families could not go past their front yards. They literally had to stay in their homes. PTSD 2 to 3 times more higher than the national rate. And then suicide is just unbelievable, 3 to 6 times higher than the general population for our tribal youth. And I've seen that firsthand, unfortunately, and it's not pretty. It's definitely something we need to be looking at. Some of the barriers that we're looking at as well that affect also telehealth and telemedicine, as we're getting to that piece there, is looking at some of the things that our tribal communities may be facing. Economic barriers. I know here in my respective state, the Hopi tribe, my tribe, depended on the Navajo generating station for jobs, for work, for revenue. Well, that shut down now pre-pandemic, and so that has a huge impact on the economy of our tribe and also Navajo Nation. I mean, they're bigger, a lot bigger, but we're smaller than they are, so it has a bigger impact. So some of the things that are happening within the economy, the lack of awareness about the tribal community issues. So just like that, like I mentioned, or how is the structure of tribal communities, and how does that affect my approach or my delivery of service? Communication styles. I mean, if we can't speak with one another, you know, might as well throw in the towel. And communication styles can vary. And, you know, whether I'm making direct eye contact with you, or if I'm speaking a lot slower, or those who I'm talking with are a lot slower, or if I'm more prone to take time to think about a response before I respond. You know, a lot of these things can impact a lot of times how we communicate with one another and what the expectations are. So really understanding those types of things as well. Stigma, and this is really in relation to health, physical health and behavioral health, the stigma associated with just having some sort of a mental health disorder can be huge, and in securing services, that can be a huge challenge. The mistrust that I spoke of, transportation is huge, especially if you live in a more rural area. Transportation can be a huge challenge. Phone accessibility, which we saw a lot of that, you know, during the pandemic, and we're still seeing it now. Folks don't have access to a phone, or have access to a phone that has enough minutes. We have what we call res phones that only work on the reservation, and you have to buy minutes for them. So there's a lot of these different things. Discrimination has always been an issue within Indian country, unfortunately. And just a lack of understanding of the different tribal structures can be some of the barriers that we're seeing in our tribal communities. We do have strengths, though. We're a very resilient people. We've been here since time immemorial. So I'm very thankful for that. I know that I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors and moving forward and moving my culture and my language and who I am forward through the work that I do, and then also just who I am. So having that family is a huge protective factor. Our elders are also part of that. Our ability to adapt has definitely been a huge protective factor. And as you've seen, so through history, a lot of times that has been there for us to continue to be who we are. Our traditional health practices, our ceremonies, all of those things are huge protective factors in what keeps us moving forward as tribal nations and people. So some of the things to be mindful of in your approaches when you're working with tribes is to increase your awareness. Do trainings like this. Take an opportunity to go out and look at what are some of the things that are happening in the tribal communities that I work with. What does their justice system look like? What does their healthcare system look like? What do they know, or what is it that I need to understand about working with this tribe? Also talk about stigma reduction, you know, whether we're talking about healthcare or mental health, really talk about doing some of those training. As I mentioned, or I was mentioned earlier, mental health first aid trainings have been a huge help in just beginning that conversation and having the ability to talk with people in the community about healthcare and understanding about it and talking about it openly. A lot of times we don't do those things with one another. So then if we're not talking about it, if we're not knowledgeable about it, then we're a little bit afraid of it. So understanding that. Also educating your stakeholders, your leaders on what some of these cultural norms are. A lot of times we go into communities and we don't go empty-handed. And I know that there's a lot of policy around the exchanging of gifts. However, sometimes, you know, especially for us, we had to look at that policy and say, you know, this is a cultural norm. This is not, you know, something that we can't not do. This is us, you know, offering something for being here, being a guest in this community. So looking at some of those things and then, you know, integrating some of the culture into perhaps some of the work that you do as well.
Holly, I
Yes.
just want to give you a 15-minute
Yes,
time check.
Looking at the time here. So telehealth and tribes. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Telehealth and tribes. Actually, telehealth in tribal communities has been happening since the 70s. And actually here in Arizona with the Tohono O'odham people down south, this is just an image here. And they actually worked with NASA and Lockheed Martin to facilitate telehealth. So telehealth has actually been happening here in Indian country through the Indian Health Service. So a lot of really good information here. That was the mobile van. Also, there continues to be telehealth work happening. I know we reached out to the Center of Excellence that's listed here on this slide during the COVID pandemic to really help tribes start to understand more about telehealth, but also secure service and also just to be more educated about the work around telehealth. Telehealth during the pandemic really was a major issue. So some really good information here and in relation to telehealth in Indian country. Some of the things, if you're looking at telehealth in tribal communities, how can we be better partners and in promoting telehealth and advocating for telehealth? I sit on here in our state, the Arizona Broadband Action Team, where we talk a lot about funding for tribes who are still trying to get up to speed in relation to telehealth. Here are just some things to consider. Make sure that your tribal leaders are involved and educated about telehealth and everything that includes from equipment to how it works, all of those things, because you need those folks to be your champions moving forward. Awareness of the geography. I will tell you here, this is in my background here, that's where I'm from, that's Hopi land. It looks like there's nothing there, but all of this land is spoken for. There's ceremonial lands, there's clan lands back there, and I can't just say, I want to build my house here on this spot. I have to go through a process to find a spot where I can build a structure. So if you can imagine outsiders saying, I'm going to come and put a tower here, it doesn't work that way. So some of those things are things that we need to be mindful of in relation to land and geography, but also to diffuse telehealth. I know I've been promoting telehealth in Indian country for at least 8 years, and there's always been hesitation from tribal communities about being in front of a camera and being vulnerable with somebody on the other end. So, you know, doing things to help diffuse some of those types of things. So lessons during COVID. You probably have maybe heard about some of these or talking about it, but I know that there were a lot of exceptions in relation to telehealth or services outside of the four walls. Those things go away once the public health emergency is ended. And I want to say they said it was going to be the end of the year, but a lot of folks are advocating that it would continue specific to Indian country so that that service can continue. Also funding for infrastructure as well is being advocated for, and then also reimbursement rates are also part of the discussion. But all of this information is also comes out of the National Indian Health Board, where you can go onto their website. Here's some resources for you, and I think you guys are going to all get a copy of this slide deck, so you'll have some of this information that you can reference. All right, okay, we got 8 minutes. Here we go. Things you need to know to be a good tribal partner is to never assume. We are all different. You and I are different. Tribes are all different. We grew up differently. You heard I was born into the military. I'm not a res girl. So just because I say I'm Hopi, it's so funny. Everybody will say, oh, do you know so-and-so? Do you know so-and-so? And I'm like, no, I don't know these people. I didn't grow up out there. I'm still learning. So we never want to assume it, you know, unfortunately, it takes less than a couple of seconds to offend someone. So we never want to assume. We don't want to think that we know about everyone. Generalizing also, you hear the terms, you know, American Indian, Alaskan Native, or maybe you hear Native. I would recommend, if you're approaching someone and you're not sure what tribal affiliation they are, just go up and say, you know, hi, you know, where are you from? Or what tribe are you from? Those are more acceptable ways to find out and not generalize about someone that you might be engaging with or working with, and understanding that everyone comes from different tribes. But even us Hopis, like the second Mesas talk different than the third Mesas, and third Mesas do things different than the first Mesa people, but we're all Hopi, so we're all different. We have very strong ties to our beliefs, our connectedness to all the elements, everything from the bugs to the clouds. Everyone has a spirit. Even when people are gone, their spirits are still there. And a lot of these things are make up a lot of who our tribal members are. They're very much in tune with their spirituality, but again, variation. Not everyone is like that either. So you might have someone who's more traditional or more cultural than another person. So again, all of this comes out in those relationships and conversations that you're having once you're making, you know, that connection to an individual. Some of the things that we're looking at infusing into services in relation to what we would call traditional healing type activities are things that, you know, a lot of folks can do. If you're looking at doing storytelling or talking circles, a lot of these things were done over the Zoom platforms or the different platforms during the pandemic to keep folks, especially during AA sessions. A lot of the AA sessions in tribal communities have a little bit of a cultural flair, if you will, to it, or have a talking circle piece to it. And those were all done even over, you know, the virtual world. You can still implement some of these things. A lot of our traditional healers were still smudging, even though they're smudging from where they are at. But it's just perhaps the act of doing that and what it means. Our social structures, we're all related. You hear the way I introduce myself, and that's to make the connection with the people that I'm talking with. A lot of times, if I was speaking to people in this region, I might end up having an uncle or a sister or a brother just in my identifying where I'm from and what clans I represent, because we're all connected. A lot of that also has an impact on how decisions are made, depending on, you know, what tribe they're from or how they're making these connections. And so you might hear folks refer to one another as relatives. A lot of times it's just making sure that we understand we're all connected in some way. Tribes are paternal and maternal, and that has a huge impact on how tribal members go through their lives and through their milestones. Again, the values, we're looking at community and culture. We're more communicative versus communal than individual. So if you think about that, in your approach. Who are all the supports? Who are all the folks that I need to work on building that trust with to make sure that I'm successful in the work that I'm doing? How can I incorporate some of these things? A lot of times when I'm going to a place and there's, you know, I'm trying to kind of break the ice, if you will, I might ask someone if it's a man, you know, talking to them about, you know, how's your field doing this summer? Or are you going hunting this this fall or something? And then the difference that makes and how the conversation moves forward is night and day. So if you know those things about those tribes, then that's also a way to really work towards building and fostering those relationships. Here are some things also to put in your medicine bag. You're all going to walk away with medicine bags, and all of these pieces of medicine are going to go in there and help you be successful. If you want to do that, you need to have a champion, a broker, a liaison, whatever you want to call it, who can help you with these things. You have to be committed, you have to be consistent, and you have to have a sense of humility and not rush, because it takes time. The partnerships that I built with tribes in my service area have taken years, and some of them have had good experiences and some have had bad experiences. I can never go into a tribal community thinking that I'm automatically accepted because I'm Hopi. I represent a non-tribal entity, and so therefore I'm a guest in whatever community I'm welcomed into. And if I'm not welcomed, and I have had those experiences where we were not able to follow through on a commitment that was made. I was escorted off of a tribal reservation by my brother, who just happened to be the BIA police chief for that community, came back and told me, Hall, I'm sorry, but the tribe doesn't want you here. You have to leave. And my partner and I were escorted off the tribal land. That was probably the worst experience ever, but it was also a very very much a learning experience. And I share that with you because this can be serious. If you're not welcome into tribal lands, the outcome can be very serious. So just some tips there for you. Some more here. We do love our tribal humor or our native humor. If you ever get a chance to look up native humor, you probably see some fun folks come up in ways to connect. We do kind of use that a lot of times and have used it during the pandemic as well. But just, you know, here are some things that hopefully you can use in moving forward and being successful in your work. And I will just leave you with learning about you know, accepting some of these things and incorporating that diversity in the work you do in your personal lives will really improve your effectiveness, whether it's in work or in your personal life. So thank you for listening to me, Asquale. I appreciate the time. And if you have any questions after this, here is my contact information. You can always reach out to me and ask whatever questions you want. So I think I made it. 2 minutes to spare.
2 minutes. Yes, you did make it. That was, I can't think of a more inspiring, awesome, wonderful presentation by anybody I've ever heard, to be perfectly honest. It was just outstanding. Now we do not have, unfortunately, time for questions. There were a lot of great questions, and I cannot prioritize one over the other. They are all wonderful questions. Now, some of them were answered. There were also a lot of great resources posted in the chat and comments back and forth. Holly, we're going to save everything so you can see the comments and the flattering comments and the connections that people were making because of this webinar. It's simply amazing. So for those of you who are attending, yes, one, it is being recorded. We will transcribe it hopefully by the end of the day, if not early first thing tomorrow morning, and post it on our website. Chris has been putting it throughout the conversation in the chat, and we'll show it later as well. We are going to save the questions, and we are going to impose upon Holly and her good nature to answer all of them, and we will get answers to the questions, and we will post them to everybody. So everybody will have the answers as well. So like I said, there's just been some wonderful questions, comments, and everything in the chat. Next slide. There we go. So this presentation again has been brought to you by the Arizona Department of Health Services, the Arizona Telemedicine Program, and its Southwest Telehealth Resource Center subsidiary. For upcoming webinars and events, please visit our website, although I'm not sure anything could ever top this, like I said. Next slide. As always, your opinion is very valuable, and if you could please just take a few minutes to complete an online survey. As you exit the meeting, the webinar, you will be taken directly to the short survey. Fill it out. It has a comment section, request for other topics, and so on. And again, Holly, just absolutely amazing. Like I said, there's a lot of really good questions. But we are at the hour, actually a little bit over, and we will do our best to get answers to these wonderful questions. Like I said, there was a ton of information presented, and we will get all that out to everyone. So thank you all so much, and everyone enjoy the rest of your afternoon.